Hello, welcome to the Hexavalent Chromium Exposure and Welding Operations webinar. Hopefully everyone's here who's going to join us.
I don't know, somebody. There it goes, but I don't hear.
Our agenda is going to be to go over the OSHA hexavalent chromium standards, to talk about some of the major processes and industries where exposures are encountered, but we're going to emphasize exposure in the welding trades, and then talk about recognition, evaluation, prevention of exposure, and if we can't prevent it, to at least control it. So hexavalent chromium is the toxic form of chromium. It's basically a positive ion that's formed by giving up 6 electrons, and it's found in a lot of different compounds, and it's said that over 80 occupational groups are exposed to hexavalent chromium. But in its naturally occurring state, it's found as a trivalent compound in chrome ore, and chrome ore is then used to produce metallic chrome. And they say that 85% of chrome is used to, or 85% of chromium that's mined is used to make metal alloys. And that's because it's highly corrosion resistant. So what you're seeing now is even in some of the like power plants, they're changing out mild steel piping for stainless steel just because it's more cost efficient, that, you know, in terms of save labor cost or save downtime, because it lasts so much longer. In terms of the trivalent chrome, which is considered a less hazardous form, that occurs naturally, and that's often used industrially in like furnaces or for fire ovens, you know, to make bricks and things like that, furnaces, because that has a very high melting point, and that's when you see also the hex chromium produced, because in the presence of heat and mineral bases and oxygen, you see the formation of hexavalent chromium. And you also see formation of hexavalent chromium in welding because of the, in the presence also of oxygen, high temperatures. In terms of routes of exposure for occupational settings, inhalation is the primary route of exposure for dust, mist, and fumes. Eyes and skin contact are also important for the liquid or water-soluble compounds. Major health effects are lung cancer, and this is primarily what the OSHA regulations came into being for, to prevent lung cancer, nasal and sinus cancer, bronchitis, asthma, strong sensitizer, nasal ulcers and perforations known as chrome holes, and skin ulcers, irritation, and contact dermatitis. The 3 OSHA standards that have come online in the last 10, 15 years are applicable to general industry, construction, and shipyards. And if you go on the OSHA.gov website, you can search for these by their citations, which are 1910, 1026 for general industry, 1926, 1126 for construction, or 1915, 1026 for shipyards. And I did want to mention too, for the, in terms of the skin ulcers and sensitization, that chromium is second only, or hexachrome is second only to nickel in terms of being a allergic metal. So that's actually a really important point beyond just the lung cancer issue. This is a slide from one of the hearings that were held during the rulemaking process at OSHA. And I wanted to show it just to make the point that, when OSHA promulgates standards, they have to consider more than just the health effects. They also have to consider economic impact and technological feasibility. And this was one of the building trades panels, and I'm there reading some comments for the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union, but there's a lot of different industry groups and various interests that are making their case, trying to have some impact on the regulations. So in terms of the key elements of the standards, which are very similar across industries with some variations, these elements are, the scope, the permissible exposure limits, exposure assessment requirements, regulated areas which are not in the construction standards, methods of compliance, respiratory protection, protective clothing, hygiene areas and practice, medical surveillance, which are required if you have 30 days or more exposure above the action level, communication and training requirements, and record keeping. So in terms of scope, the standards apply to all exposures with 3 exceptions. One is where you have the application of pesticides. It still applies if you're manufacturing pesticides or you're in an environment where you may be exposed, because there's pesticides in use, say. But, in the case of like farmers or agricultural workers where they're applying pesticides, that would not be covered. That typically would be an EPA, jurisdiction, so to speak. It also exempts Portland cement, which does have hexchromium and is associated with contact dermatitis. However, there is directive language for OSHA compliance officers that has them look for things like, hand washing facilities and other things that would try to protect against contact dermatitis when they go on a job where there is Portland cement. And then the other thing is, if an employer can document with objective data and other, means that they cannot exceed exposures beyond 0.5 micrograms per cubic meter averaged over 8 hours, then they can make a case for being exempted out of the standard. But that is difficult to do. And I was just reading the compliance directive, what they have to do to make a case for that. And it's kind of tough. So it can be done, but it's kind of a high bar. So whenever OSHA comes up with when they do the rulemaking, they have to do a risk assessment. And, in order to do that, they have to come up with an estimate of how many deaths they would expect to see from a particular hazard per 1,000 workers. And, the benzene decision, as it was called, kind of set the standard for that, which with that particular standard, it was 10 deaths per 1,000 workers. Asbestos, it was 6.7 per 1,000 workers. In the case of hexavalent chromium, it was actually much less protective because they estimate 10 to 45 excess lung cancer deaths per 1,000 workers based on the PEL that standard came in at. So we can really expect more cases of cancer at the current PEL for hexavalent chromium. It was actually less protective. So the PEL for the hexchrome standard is 5 micrograms per cubic meter of air, and the action level is 2.5 micrograms per cubic of air. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the action level, this is like a trigger for a lot of things like the medical surveillance and training and things, other elements of the standard. But to give you an idea of how high that is, there's a group called the American Conference of Government Industrial Hygienists, and they review various chemical hazards in the workplace more regularly than other agencies, and rather than more regular than OSHA anyway. And their current recommended exposure limit, they call threshold limit values, or TLVs. Their TLV for hexavalent chromium is 0.2 micrograms per cubic meter. So their TLV is 25 times the PEL, to give you an idea of how, where they think the current science is with that. The other element of the standard is exposure assessment. Employers are required to assess what the airborne concentration of hexavalent chromium is in their workplace. And they can do that through two ways, either a scheduled monitoring program where you do initial monitoring and then you do periodic monitoring. And dependent on what the levels are, that dictates what the frequency is. So if it's below the action level, then you can discontinue monitoring. But if it's greater than the action level, but less than the PEL, then it's every 6 months. And then if it's greater than PL, it's every 3 months until you can get it down, lower, ideally below the action level. If you don't want to go that route, if you're in an environment, say like construction, where the job may not even be more than 6 months, or you can do something called performance monitoring, where you might do a little bit of air monitoring, but maybe you also have something called objective data, where maybe an industry group has compiled data from multiple job sites, and they've really done a good job of documenting the variables, like the materials used, the use of ventilation, the number of hours of the task, and anything that would affect the exposure. So what they sometimes call exposure determinants. If you can put all that together and really get a meaningful estimate of what the exposures are, then OSHA might look at that as good objective data and accept that as performance monitoring data. Another element, a very important element of the standard, is methods of compliance, and that would be engineering and work practice controls, which would be the primary means of control. And then, if necessary, supplementing that with respiratory protection when the controls aren't enough. And then, while sometimes allowed as an administrative control, rotation of employees to reduce the exposure to any individual employee would not be allowed by this standard. That's not allowed. Okay, so this standard was phased in over like a 4-year period to allow employers time to get their engineering controls online. But at this point, that's historical, because everything was required by 2010. So just to review in terms of general principles of controlling hazards, OSHA always recognizes that there's a hierarchy of controls, and at the top of that list is engineering controls. So what we mean by that is, that could mean isolation, where we actually contain the hazard in say, like, for instance, there's things called glove boxes in the case of asbestos, where they may have a metal box and they actually have a place where you could put your hands in these gloves, and the hazard is contained in that box where you really don't even come into contact with it. You can manipulate whatever you're working with through a glove, that's inside that box. Substitution might be, say, in the case of where, say Federal Highway Administration, like back in the 90s, issued a memo to the states that they had to stop using lead-based paint in order to get federal highway funds. So, the states had to substitute out a hazardous paint for one that was hopefully less hazardous. That would be substitution. But in the case of, say, welding fume, that for stainless steel or hexavalent chromium may be a problem, ventilation is probably going to be the most common form of engineering control, because when, say, a contractor goes to a major client in a power plant or a refinery or whatever, they don't have the luxury to say, to dictate what the materials will be. So in that case, they have to sort of bring their controls with them. And often that'll be ventilation. And we'll talk about the distinction between mechanical and local, but local exhaust is usually the better ventilation. Going down the hierarchy, the next best thing is administrative controls, and that usually requires, that results in, reducing the exposure time. Like we talked about before, that might mean, trying to schedule the work so that someone who has multiple tasks, that some of which generate the hazard and some that don't, you try to schedule it so that the worker is not doing the work that generates the exposure all day long. but like I said, this particular standard does not allow rotation. Then your last resort is respirators, because they don't always work that well, and they're really just not allowed by the standard. They always want you to implement engineering controls. And a lot of times employers don't realize that when you institute respirators, that you can't just give workers respirators. It has to be part of a comprehensive respiratory protection program. And there's a whole standard out there that requires that, you involve fit testing and medical evaluation, and there's a lot more to it. So in terms of ventilation, there's a difference between mechanical ventilation, which generally just sort of moves the contaminant around, and local exhaust ventilation. So with mechanical ventilation, like these fans, you're usually just diluting the contaminant. And, that can be an improvement if you're in a confined space, or, a room where there's not a lot of air. But, sometimes you're just blowing the contaminant into the face of another worker, so it's not ideal. What's preferred is local exhaust ventilation, because with local exhaust ventilation, you're actually capturing the fume and pulling it away from the worker's breathing zone. So before we focus in on welding, some industries where the majority of potential exposure are, and I think most of this information came from NIOSH, are welding, painting, electroplating, steel mills, iron and steel foundries, wood preserving, and paint coating and production. And then there's some more here listed. I won't go through them all, but you can see a lot of it has to do with, the paint industry, again, plating, pigment production, chromate, copper, arsenic producers, and then many more that, we mentioned there were like 80 that have more limited potential for exposure. But really, among all those different occupations, welding makes up the biggest share. Almost half of the people exposed to hexavalent chromium are welders. And within that category of welders, it's stainless steel welders. So by definition, to be classified as stainless steel, the steel has to have more than 10% chromium in it. And so this is really the primary source of hexavalent chromium in the US. And within that group of welders, the majority, it's not a huge majority, it's almost a 50-50, but it's decidedly more in construction than in general industry. So some of you might be interested in knowing, what are the exposures then in terms of welding fumes. And a few years back, we looked at John Meeker, who's a faculty member at Michigan, and myself and colleague at University of North Carolina, Mike Flynn, looked at some exposure data for welding, 181 measurements from OSHA, 124 measurements from the Welding Institute, and then some surveys conducted by CPWR. You can see the sample size, largest for OSHA, 181, the Welding Institute, 124, smaller sample size for CPWR, but we collected a lot more detail. And we did some trials looking at local exhaust ventilation, but this was in a controlled setting. Now, this was welding data total, not all of this was stainless steel. But, we looked at all that data, trying to look at different exposure trends and where we could look at the impact of certain variables. We did that. And, the paper has a lot more detail, but just to kind of give you a little quick summary, what we found was that the percent of measurements that were over the PEL were 9%. That paper was just focused on hex chrome, though. 9% of the measurements were for the OSHA data was over the PEL. 13% of the TWI measurements were over the PEL, and 25% of the CPWR data were over the PEL, which was likely, at least in part, having to do with the fact that the data was largely from construction. But there's probably other theories we could come up with for that too. So in the controlled study we did with CPWR, just focused on use of local exhaust ventilation, we found that the LEV reduced exposure by 68%. And some of the predictors that we were able to, show had impacts, statistically, were use of the LEV, the base metal, which, base metal is kind of a surrogate for what type of material was in the electrode, because typically like 90% of the fume comes from the electrode. And then the welding process, whether it was stick, MIG, TIG, that kind of thing. So, some of the factors that would increase exposure risk in construction is that it's a very mobile occupation. There aren't fixed workstations where you kind of control things a little better. There's a heavy reliance on stick and MIG welding, which tends to be a higher exposure process. It's very rare. LEV is fairly rare. Very long work days, so it's not uncommon for, say, the Boilermaker trades when they do these turnaround projects where they're doing 12-hour days, 7 days a week. And also they very commonly work in enclosed workspaces, like in this picture was taken at a boiler power plant where these guys are working in tight boiler spaces like this. And there, I think he's doing some MIG welding right there. So this is a kind of busy slide, but this is some of the data for the hexavalent chromium data. And so you have the number of samples and then the median, which is, just the middle number, order all the samples and take the sample that's right in the middle, the exposure concentration in the middle. And then the hazard ratio was the median divided by the PEL, the maximum measurement, and then hazard ratio for the maximum divided by the PEL. And remember, our PEL is 5 micrograms per cubic meter. So looking at stick, we see that the median was right about at the PEL, and the maximum was over 3.5 times the PEL. The MIG was, the maximum was like twice that. Plasma arc that's a very high exposure number, so we're not surprised to see that that's like 4.5 times. Carbon arc also is a high exposure task. This number is low, but there's only one number, and they could have been doing it for a short period of time, so we didn't get a high number. You can see no local exhaust ventilation. The maximum number is also very high. And then as you go on down, no local exhaust ventilation, stick welding, you can see that the median number was over the PEL. The maximum was 2. So just some data to kind of get an idea of the fact that exposures can easily be above the PEL. So then the question becomes, so how do we control the hazard? And these are some pictures of what it looks like, pictures taken from our control studies we did. And you can see the fumes are very visible without the LEV. And then on the right, you can see how the little hood is pretty effective at pulling the fume into it. So the studies we did at a pipe fitter training center outside of Chicago, and we looked at 3 different portable LEV units that you can purchase, out in the market. And we did these repeat randomized trials, and we looked at systems that contractors and union training folks recommended, that they thought, we looked at a lot of different systems that we as industrial hygienists thought would work well, and then had them select what they thought would work well. And these are the systems we came up with. And this is all research that was done from CPWR, Center for Construction Research and Training. And there's John Meeker there. And the results were that without local exhaust ventilation, the exposures were anywhere from 2 to over 3 times the OSHA PEL. And with the LEV, we reduced the exposures to 56 to 94%. And this is a video, if we can get it to come on. It might take a little bit, but they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, so this should be. Obviously, this is without. So, Okay, so you can see that it worked really well. And if you want to get a little more detail, you can go to the cpwr.com website and go to completed research if you don't remember this link. But again, you can go back and find, this webinar. But go to completed research, and the very first research project, AIMS, will come up. And if you go to the sidebar, it has the summary sheet, and then it has detailed reports that will give you more detail. So another thing that was done there was development and evaluation of training on correct use, because with welding, LEV is really highly dependent on the welder placing that hood as close as he can to the weld position. Like you can see here in this picture, if the hood's not placed like where it needs to be, then it won't work at all. And if the worker has their head positioned like between the hood and the weld, then it's just going to be sucking the fumes right into their nose. And then also repositioning the hood while they're traveling down the weld seam is very important. So this work was done with Sergio Caparelli from the University of Puerto Rico, and what we found was that we did some monitoring before and after the training. We found that not only did the training increase knowledge, because there were the typical pre and post quizzes done and all that, but also there was a reduction in exposure, which was pretty impressive. So there are some resources on OSHA.gov you can get if you go to, I think there's a topic page for hexavalent chromium, and there are these controlling exposure fact sheets for electroplating, bridge painting, welding, aerospace, which is important. I don't know that I mentioned that, but painting in aerospace industries is real important. That's something to check out. Some conclusions and recommendations. So we know that hexavalent chromium exposures are very pervasive and common in stainless steel welding. Certain processes, I failed to point that out. I wish I did. In that table, I meant to show you that for TIG welding, let me see if I can go back real quick. Okay, if you look at the TIG, the blue line across here, because it's an important point. The TIG, we only had 2 measurements, but this is pretty representative, that the median exposure there was 0.04 micrograms per cubic meter. Very, very low. So that's actually an engineering control in the sense that, the selection of the welding process can reduce exposure. So that's an important point that I meant to make that I did not make. Oops, excuse me. So certain processes such as TIG welding typically have very low exposures. Portable LEV systems are available, and many are effective if used correctly. It's important that workers be trained in correct use. Also want to say that, Pennsylvania OSHA Consultation is an excellent resources for small employers who need help in identifying potential hexachromium hazards. We're designed specifically for small and medium-sized businesses, which is defined for our purposes as 250 employees at a single site or 500 corporate-wide. And priority assistance is given to employers in high-hazard industries or employers involved in hazardous operations. Large businesses can request services as well, but in that case, it's limited in scope what we look at. There's no citations, no penalties. So it's different than OSHA enforcement. Citations for violations are not issued. There's no penalties, but the employer has to agree to correct any serious or imminent dangers that are identified. And if they don't, then we have to refer them to OSHA enforcement, but that's very, very rare. It's best part of it, it's free of charge, and the employer avoids any kind of OSHA penalty or litigation cost and reduces workers' comp costs, minimizes equipment damage and product losses. So it's estimated that one consultant identifies on average 7 serious or other than serious hazards, which saves the employer approximately $90,538 in OSHA fines per visit. So in other words, if OSHA were to come on site and find what we found, that's, they'd wind up probably fining you that much. So this is our main office is in Indiana University, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, PA. There's our 1-800 number, 382-1241. That's the number to call if you have any general questions. I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have a web page, a Facebook page, Twitter page. I guess it's not a Twitter page, Twitter site. Next upcoming webinar is on confined spaces, Brian Broger, and that's on October 17th. There's our web page, and there's some references for this presentation. There's a great small entity compliance guide for hexavalent chromium you might want to check out too there. And I'll leave this up so you can have the website. And like I said, if you use the chat function for this website to put in your question, we will try to respond. And I appreciate anybody who's here. I can't see you, but I appreciate you for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.